If a superpower builds a massive tariff wall against you, can you just sign a piece of paper, flip a switch, and completely rewire your nation's economic survival?
Right, like just magically bypass the problem.
Exactly. I mean, you hear this idea everywhere today. You literally can't escape it. Politicians are constantly throwing around terms like decoupling or, friendshoring.
Oh, absolutely. It's the buzzword of the decade.
Yeah, and there's this incredibly seductive narrative taking hold right now, this idea that we can safely isolate our economies within political alliances, that if we just build supply chains exclusively with our friends, we can totally insulate ourselves from our geopolitical rivals.
Sounds great on a campaign poster, right?
Totally. But what if that entire concept is just a dangerous illusion? What if there is this invisible, unbreakable law of geoeconomic gravity that just crushes these political fantasies every single time?
Well, it is arguably the ultimate geopolitical illusion of our time. We love to believe that, human willpower or just the stroke of a pen on an international treaty can somehow override the fundamental laws of geography.
Like we can just legislate away reality?
Exactly. But history tells a profoundly different and, frankly, a really jarring story. And that is exactly what we are dissecting in this deep dive.
Right.
We're looking at a truly fascinating working paper by David S. Jacks.
Published in the National Bureau of Economic Research, right?
Right, the NBER. And it's titled Defying Gravity, the 1932 Imperial Economic Conference and the Reorientation of Canadian Trade.
It's such a great title.
It really is. Because what this paper does is it puts a real-world, incredibly high-stakes historical experiment under a microscope. We are going back to the 1930s, right in the absolute teeth of the Great Depression.
Which was, the worst possible time for an economic experiment.
Without a doubt. So Canada, feeling completely betrayed and battered by the United States, attempted to totally detach its economy from its giant neighbor. They wanted to redirect their entire economic lifeblood across the ocean to the British Empire.
And we are going to use a massive, 179,000-point data microscope to peel back the political spin of that whole era.
Yeah, the data in this paper is just staggering.
It's going to blow your mind. We're going to look at how an arrogant policy caused this fiery retaliation. We'll look at the incredibly messy reality of trying to trade exclusively with your so-called friends.
With friends like those, right?
Exactly. And we'll get into the deadly fine print that silently assassinated a global empire's trade. We are going to uncover these terrifying, face-slapping data revelations that prove exactly why political willpower cannot defeat geography.
But to really grasp why a country like Canada would attempt what, looks in hindsight like sheer economic suicide.
Just to prove a point.
Right, just to prove a point, we have to rewind a bit. We need to look at the incredibly fragile, completely hollow boom that set them up for the bust in the first place.
To take us back, because the 1920s in Canada seem like the golden age.
Oh, you absolutely cannot understand the desperation of the 1930s without first understanding the wild euphoria of the 1920s. To the rest of the world, 1920s Canada looked like an absolute economic miracle.
The numbers are insane.
They are genuinely staggering. Between 1921 and 1929, real GDP per capita in Canada exploded by nearly 50.9%.
50.9% in a decade. That's almost impossible to comprehend today.
It is, and Canadian real exports grew by 30% in that exact same window. They were riding this massive historic wave of immigration, foreign investment, and surging trade.
So if you were just a casual observer, looking at the top-line macroeconomic indicators, you would think Canada had discovered the perpetual motion machine of prosperity.
You really would. It looked flawless.
A 50% bump in per capita GDP guarantees a politician a lifetime in office. But when you actually dig into the sources, you quickly realize this wasn't some balanced, self-sustaining miracle.
No, it was incredibly narrow.
Super narrow. The data shows that 15% of their entire export economy was literally just Canadian wood pulp and newsprint going south.
Right, just feeding the American newspaper industry.
Yeah, American newspapers were booming. And another 32% of their exports was just wheat and flour, mostly going across the Atlantic to bake bread in Europe.
Think about the mechanics of that vulnerability for a second. When you combine just those two sectors, nearly half of this so-called miracle economy is resting on just a couple of raw commodities.
Just two things.
Two things being sold to a very, very narrow set of foreign buyers.
I look at that and I see a weightlifter boasting about a massive chest and biceps, but totally ignoring the fact that they are standing on toothpicks for legs.
That's a perfect analogy.
Sure, you look incredibly strong in the upper body, but your foundation is completely out of your control. If almost half of your massive national growth comes from just a couple things sold to a couple places, aren't you essentially putting your country's neck in a noose and cheerfully handing the rope to a foreign buyer?
Handing over the rope is exactly what they did. And honestly, they didn't even realize how tight it was getting.
Because everyone was making so much money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because while the headlines across Canada were screaming about this endless golden boom, the underlying microdata from the mid-1920s was already flashing bright red warning signs.
The stuff the politicians weren't looking at.
Right. In the paper, Jax details this phenomenon we can basically call the scissors effect.
Okay, break that down for us.
So if you look at the monthly trade ledgers, Canadian exports actually peaked really early, around late 1925. But their imports, what average Canadians were buying from the rest of the world, on credit, fueled by all this optimism that just kept climbing and climbing relentlessly through the late 1920s.
So if you picture a pair of scissors opening up, the top blade is imports continuing to skyrocket.
Yep.
And the bottom blade is exports completely flattening out. And the gap between them is just growing and growing.
And that massive gap represents a vanishing trade surplus. Canada's trade surplus plummeted from a very healthy $275 million in late 1925 down to just $90 million by 1928.
Oh, wow, that is a huge drop.
It's a free fall. Relative to their GDP, their balance of trade dropped from nearly 8% down to barely 2%.
In just a few years.
Exactly. What this tells us, and this is a crucial piece of counterintuitive history that most people totally miss, is that the Canadian economy was actually already sliding into a severe structural depression way before the infamous 1929 stock market crash even happened.
That is wild.
The so-called miracle had already run completely out of steam. They were just coasting on fumes.
Which brings up a really scary kind of face-slapping dynamic. The most dazzling engine of your growth is exactly what turns into the deadliest poison when a crisis hits.
Precisely. You get addicted to that single revenue stream.
Yeah, you build your entire national railway and your port infrastructure around servicing that one specific American customer. And when that customer sneezes, your entire nation ends up on life support.
They were entirely hopelessly dependent on buoyant American incomes and open commercial access to the U.S. market. So picture the scene in the summer of 1929. The global economy is just starting to crack.
People are getting nervous?
Panic is setting in everywhere. And the United States, facing its own massive domestic pressures, decides to fundamentally rewrite the rules of international trade.
Okay, let's play this out because this is where it gets crazy. You are Canada. You are balancing on this precarious economic tightrope, completely dependent on the U.S. buying your goods.
And then the U.S. just pulls out a pair of shears and cuts the rope.
Why on earth would the U.S. do that? If Canada is supplying 15% of their newsprint and huge amounts of their food, why would America intentionally bankrupt its own supplier? That makes literally zero economic sense.
From a purely macroeconomic standpoint, it makes no sense at all. It's madness. But from a domestic political survival standpoint, in 1930, it was just business as usual.
Because politicians just wanted to save their own seats.
Enter the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. This remains one of the most infamous, disastrous pieces of economic legislation in human history.
It's legendary for how bad it was.
The United States Congress, in this desperate attempt to protect domestic industries from the gathering economic storm, just went into a total frenzy of local protectionism.
Even like a free-for-all.
It really was. Politicians were basically trading votes. A senator from a dairy state would go up to a senator from a manufacturing state and say, hey, I'll vote for tariffs on imported watches to protect your local factories if you vote for tariffs on imported milk to protect my local farmers.
Classic log rolling. Everyone gets a favor, and nobody bothers to look at the final bill for the country.
The result was an absolute monstrosity of a law. They slapped crippling high tariffs on over 20,000 individual items.
20,000?
Yes. Now, put yourself in Canada's shoes for a minute. You share a 2,000-mile continuous border with the United States.
The longest undefended border in the world.
Exactly. They are your biggest customer by an astronomical margin. You are watching this legislation make its way through the U.S. Congress, and you realize it is going to absolutely devastate your agricultural and resource sectors overnight.
So naturally, Canada tries to intervene, right? They send official diplomatic protests.
They basically beg the U.S. to reconsider,
pointing out how deeply intertwined their economies are and how many American businesses rely on Canadian goods to survive.
And the response from the U.S. is just It's jaw-dropping.
What did they say?
It is the ultimate face-slapping reality of how raw geopolitical power operates when it's blinded by panic. The author quotes the staggering, completely unapologetic response from the U.S. House Ways and Means Committee to Canada's desperate protests.
I can't wait to hear this.
They explicitly stated, and I quote, "We're not so concerned with American exports, but only with the prevention of imports."
Wow. We only care about locking our doors. We don't care if you freeze to death outside. I mean, the sheer arrogance of that statement.
It's breathtaking.
It's like a bakery banning its best, highest-paying customer from the store just to save a few pennies on free samples. How did the U.S. not realize this was going to totally blow up in their face and trigger a massive retaliation?
They were completely blinded by the illusion that the U.S. market was so big, so self-sufficient, that it just didn't need the rest of the world.
The ultimate hubris.
And the political blowback in Canada was nothing short of nuclear.
Which is entirely understandable. I mean, if you are a Canadian wheat farmer who just lost your entire livelihood, your entire family savings, because some politician in Washington wanted to score cheap points with a local constituency, you aren't just annoyed, you are furious.
Furious and demanding blood. In the Canadian election of July 1930, which actually became known as the Canada First election, the incumbent Liberal Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, tried a really moderate approach.
Trying to keep things calm?
He offered some minor, symbolic, retaliatory tariffs, basically try not to rock the boat too much.
And how did that go over?
The voters completely rejected him. Instead, the conservative leader, Richard B. Bennett, won a massive landslide victory on a brutal, uncompromising platform.
He went hard.
Very hard. Bennett didn't promise to negotiate. He didn't promise a diplomatic solution at all. He literally promised to use high tariffs to, quote, blast away into markets that have been closed.
Blast away. That is not the language of careful economic policy. That is the language of war.
And this is where the dynamic gets genuinely terrifying, because we see a profound psychological shift in the Canadian government here. This wasn't just about balancing ledgers or protecting infant industries anymore. It was about wounded national pride.
It was raw vengeance.
Bennett immediately enacted sweeping emergency tariffs. And in his rage, he didn't just target the United States, he actually stripped away special trading privileges that Canada had previously given to Britain.
Wait, he went after Britain too?
Yeah, it was a complete, blinded, draw up the bridges and man the walls moment. Everyone was an enemy. The data shows these new emergency tariffs likely reduced U.S. exports to Canada by 21% almost overnight.
So, confronted by an economic behemoth that just slapped them in the face, the smaller nation decides to set itself on fire, just try and burn the monster.
Exactly.
It's a complete breakdown of rationality.
It is a breakdown of rationality, but as you noted earlier, Canada's economy was an export machine.
Yeah.
A country of that massive geographic size, with that much raw material and agricultural output, physically cannot survive in a vacuum.
They have to sell it to someone.
Right. If they were going to burn their bridges with the United States, they desperately needed a new lifeboat, and they needed it fast.
And they convinced themselves they could find it by retreating into the arms of the British Empire.
Which sets the stage for the 1932 Imperial Economic Conference in Ottawa.
Okay, let's set the scene for Ottawa. Because by mid-1932, the situation isn't just a recession anymore. It is an economic apocalypse.
It's dire.
Listen to these numbers. Canadian exports to the U.S. had evaporated by 67.3%. Two-thirds of your primary export market just gone into thin air.
Wiped out.
Overall GDP is down 24.1%. Entire industries are in free fall. People are literally starving. So Canada decides to host this grand conference, bringing together Great Britain, Australia, India, New Zealand, South Africa, basically the whole empire.
Sure, family.
The goal was to create an exclusive walled garden economy, a massive friendshoring exercise decades before that term even existed.
And the public relations spin on this conference was absolutely beautiful. It was portrayed to the newspapers as a grand family reunion.
Very heartwarming.
The glorious empire coming together to protect its own against a hostile, chaotic world. But when you look at the actual minutes, the diaries, and the behind-closed-doors negotiation...
Let me guess, it wasn't a family reunion.
It was a back-alley knife fight.
I knew it!
It was an absolute bloodbath of self-interest. Everyone talked a really big game about imperial unity in front of the cameras. But underneath the table, they were viciously fighting over what historians famously called meat, wheat, and the Soviets.
Meat, wheat, and the Soviets. I love that phrase. It perfectly captures the hypocrisy of the whole event.
It really does.
Everyone expects an umbrella in a storm to keep them safe, but underneath the umbrella, they're all stabbing each other to get the driest spot.
That is exactly what was happening.
But help me understand the mechanics here. If they are all part of the same empire and they're all facing the exact same global depression, how are they so bitterly divided? What was the actual friction in the room?
The friction came from the fact that their fundamental economic models were completely at odds with each other. Great Britain, as the industrialized center of the empire, wanted to lower internal barriers.
Make trade easier.
Right. They wanted the dominions, like Canada and Australia, to drop their tariffs so Britain could sell them manufactured goods cheaply and then buy cheap food in return.
Sounds logical for Britain.
But Canada and Australia absolutely refused to lower their own protective walls. Their domestic manufacturers would have been crushed by British factories.
Oh, because British factories were way more efficient.
Exactly. Instead, Canada demanded that Britain raise its walls against the rest of the world to artificially make Canadian goods more competitive.
Wait, so Canada wasn't saying, let's trade freely within the family. Canada was saying, we know our wheat is way more expensive to ship across the ocean, so you, Britain, need to slap massive taxes on everyone else, so your citizens are forced to buy our more expensive wheat.
Exactly. It wasn't about free trade at all. And it went even further than just tariffs. Canada aggressively pushed Britain to enact a total physical blockade on Soviet wheat and timber.
A blockade?
Yes. Canada knew Soviet exports were cheaper and geographically much closer to London, so they didn't want to compete on a level playing field. They wanted Britain to use its geopolitical power to create a pure monopoly for Canadian goods in the British market.
That is wild. Just telling the mother country, hey, you need to block everyone else so I can overcharge you.
That's essentially it.
If they are this bitterly divided and everyone is just looking out for their own domestic monopolies, how can they possibly agree on anything binding?
Through sheer desperation and incredibly messy, bad compromises. After weeks of brutal negotiations, they eventually signed a series of bilateral agreements.
Okay, so they got something down on paper.
They did. Canada actually gave up a significant amount of ground on paper, granting what was called preferential treatment to over 200 British goods. They lowered the tariff barriers slightly for Britain, while keeping them astronomically high for the U.S. and the rest of the world.
So the ink dries. The politicians step out of the conference rooms, flashbulbs pop, and they declare a massive historic victory.
Oh yeah, they claimed they had successfully defied the gravity of the U.S. market and secured a century of imperial prosperity.
And here is where the story takes a super fascinating turn. Because for decades after this, if you opened a standard history textbook, it would tell you the Ottawa Conference was a roaring success.
That's absolutely right. If you look at a very basic macro-level line chart of Canadian exports to the British Empire, right after the treaty went into effect in late 1932, the line just rockets upward.
Yeah, huge spike.
Exports bounced significantly. For generations, historians and politicians looked at that big upward spike and praised the conference as a miracle of policy. The political spin worked perfectly, and it just became accepted history.
But the author of our source paper, David S. Jacks, didn't trust the spin.
Not at all.
He didn't just look at the macro chart. Instead, he built this massive scientific microscope. He pulled 179,154 micro-observations of actual month-by-month, item-by-item trade ledgers from the official Canadian archives.
Yes, it's an astonishing feat of data collection.
Yeah.
It really is. He didn't just look at total trade. He looked at 9 broad commodity classes, trading with up to 119 different nations, tracking it all month by month from 1925 clear through to 1939.
That is incredibly granular.
He wanted to look past the political rhetoric and see what the actual merchants, the shipping companies, and the consumers were doing on the ground on a random Tuesday in 1933.
It's like looking at a guy's bank account on payday and concluding he's a millionaire because there's a huge spike on the first of the month.
Exactly.
But you have to look at the daily transactions for the next 29 days to see he immediately paid rent, bought groceries, and is actually completely broke by the 4th.
That's a great way to think about it.
But my question is, how do you filter out the noise? The Great Depression is happening at the exact same time. Global trade is collapsing everywhere. If Canadian trade drops, how do we know if it's because the Ottawa Treaty failed or just because the whole world is broke and nobody's buying anything?
That is the absolute genius of the methodology in this paper. They didn't just look at Canada-UK trade in a vacuum. They used a highly sophisticated econometric model.
Okay, here comes the math.
Specifically, a Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood estimator, or PPML, combined with a difference in differences approach.
Okay, stop right there. Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood. Talk to me like I'm a wheat farmer in 1932. What is that and why do we need it? Remember, no jargon.
Fair enough. Let's break down the PPML first. When you were studying trade during a massive depression, a lot of bilateral trade between specific countries drops to literal zero.
Like nothing is moving at all.
Nothing. Nobody is buying anything. Now, traditional statistical models like standard OLS regressions handle zeros very badly.
The math just breaks.
The math essentially panics, and researchers in the past often just drop those zero trade months from the data entirely, which completely distorts the reality of how bad the depression actually was. The PPML model natively handles those zero trade flows. It keeps the grim reality of the depression intact in the math.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. You need a math formula that doesn't break when trade completely stops. What about the difference in differences part?
Think of difference in differences like testing a new agricultural fertilizer.
Back to the farm. I like it.
You have two identical fields of wheat. Both fields are suffering from a terrible drought. That drought is the Great Depression. You apply the new fertilizer, which represents the Ottawa Treaty, to only one field.
Got it.
That's your treatment group. Canada's trade with the British Empire. The unfertilized fields are your control group. Canada's trade with the rest of the world.
Right.
If both fields die at the exact same rate despite the fertilizer, the fertilizer did absolutely nothing.
So they measured it at distinct points in time to see exactly when the fertilizer was applied.
Exactly. They measured it at three distinct moments. First, when the conference was merely announced in late 1931. Second, when the negotiations concluded in mid-1932. And third, when the laws were actually enacted in late 1932.
So you get a timeline of the effect.
By comparing the empire trade against the rest of world trade through these specific time windows, they mathematically isolated the treaty's actual effect for the background noise of the global depression.
Did this specific treaty create actual lasting growth that wouldn't have happened otherwise?
That's the million-dollar question.
And the punchy, face-slapping concept here is that when the raw data finally runs through this massive mathematical filter, the political miracle turns out to be an incredibly embarrassing lie.
An absolute categorical failure. When the background noise of the Depression was stripped away, the microscope revealed three counterintuitive, jaw-dropping truths that completely dismantled the 90-year-old myth of the Ottawa Conference.
Let's get into them. Revelation number one.
Revelation 1 is what we can call the panic bounce. Remember that macro chart spike we talked about earlier, the one that politicians used to claim victory?
Right, the big jump in the line graph.
The data shows that between the announcement of the conference in late 1931 and its actual enactment in late 1932, exports from Canada to the empire shot up by a highly significant 41.6%.
Wow, so wait, 41%? It did work. The treaty boosted trade.
No, because it wasn't organic economic growth.
Yeah.
It was what economists call an announcement effect. Put yourself in the shoes of a merchant in Toronto or London. You read in the paper that politicians are getting together in a few months to build massive new tariff walls, change all the rules of trade, and alter the prices of everything. What do?
I panic.
Exactly.
If I know the rules are going to change and costs might skyrocket, I try to move all my product and fill my warehouses before they change the locks.
Precisely. Merchants across the entire empire desperately scrambled to stockpile inventory and ship goods before the gates closed, or new, highly complicated rules took effect.
It was just hoarding.
It was a panic buy. It was a massive, system-wide hoarding event in anticipation of a huge disruption, not the dawn of a new, sustainable era of imperial trade.
So the politicians threw a massive party, and everyone rushed the buffet table to stuff their pockets before the doors officially opened.
That's a great way to picture it.
But what happens to a merchant's inventory after a panic buy? Their warehouses are totally full. They don't need to buy anything else for months. Did the researchers look at what happened to the trade volume once that initial hoarding phase ended? Which I guess brings us to revelation number 2.
Yes, and the result of what we call the flat line. Once the treaty officially took effect on November 15th, 1932, the study looked at the actual added growth in exports to the empire, meaning growth over and above what was happening with the rest of the world.
So comparing the fertilized field to the unfertilized field.
Exactly. And in the year following the treaty's enactment, the added growth in exports was a statistically insignificant 1.1%.
1.1%? That's a rounding error. That's essentially nothing.
It effectively dropped to zero. Think of the monumental effort here. All the grand speeches, the weeks of bitter negotiations, all the massive political capital burned, the severe disruption to global supply chains. And once the treaty was actually running, it created absolute zero new trade momentum. The panic buying stopped because the warehouses were full, and the underlying grim reality of the market just reasserted itself.
That is absolutely brutal. You burn down your relationship with your biggest customer to build this brand new alliance, and the alliance gives you a 1% bump. But it gets even worse. Let's talk about revelation number 3, the reverse trap.
This is perhaps the most damning finding of the entire paper, because it highlights how policy can actively backfire. The whole point of the Ottawa Conference, from the British perspective, was to allow the Dominions to buy cheap, duty-free manufactured goods from the Empire.
Right. Keep the money in the family.
Britain wanted Canada to buy British tractors, British textiles, British machinery. So, mathematically, imports to Canada from the UK should have skyrocketed.
Right. If Canada lowers the cost of British goods at the border, Canadians should naturally buy more of them. That's just basic supply and demand.
But the data shows the exact opposite. Starting about 18 months after the treaty, Canadian imports from the Empire actually became negative compared to the baseline control group. Yes, the free trade zone actually suffocated trade between the Allies.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here. How is it physically possible that lowering tariffs between allies actually makes them trade less with each other? Did Canadians just suddenly decide they hated the quality of British products?
Not at all. It comes down to something we can call the deadly fine print. And this is a lesson that every single modern politician pushing for friendshoring really needs to memorize and internalize.
What was the fine print?
Remember the bitter compromises we talked about earlier, the back alley knife fight over meat and wheat. Because trust was so incredibly low among the Allies, and because everyone was terrified of being locked into a bad deal, they included a tiny clause at the very bottom of the treaty.
An escape hatch.
Exactly. It stated that any signatory could cancel or modify their part of the agreement with a mere 6 months' notice.
6 months! That's absolutely nothing in the world of international trade.
Exactly. Let's connect this to the bigger picture of business certainty. Imagine you are a shipping magnate in 1932. The government comes to you and says, hey, we signed a glorious new treaty with London. We need you to spend millions of dollars building new deep water ports in Halifax. We need you laying new railway tracks to the eastern seaboard and commissioning massive new cargo fleets to handle all this new imperial trade.
And I look at the contract, and I see that Prime Minister Bennett, a man who has already proven he acts out of vengeance and wounded pride, a guy who literally ran on a platform of blasting away into markets, can just rip up the rules in 180 days if he gets into a bad mood or feels slighted by London.
Would you invest your capital?
Absolutely not. I'd sit on my cash, wait out the depression, and make zero long-term investments.
And that is exactly what the capital markets did across the entire empire. A grand political alliance means absolutely nothing to a merchant or a financier if the policy can be changed by a political mood swing.
It's just way too risky.
Policy uncertainty acts as an invisible tariff. It is a massive suffocating friction on trade. The British politician Leo Amery actually warned about this at the time. He asked a brilliant question. Who would be foolish enough to build a railway on the assurance of an export trade that could be legally destroyed before the building is even finished?
Wow. He saw it coming.
He did. The merchants didn't trust the politicians, so they didn't build the infrastructure. And without the new infrastructure, the physical trade simply couldn't flow.
So a treaty specifically designed to create a unified economic fortress instead built an invisible cage of uncertainty that literally choked its own members.
It did. But just to be absolutely scientifically certain, just to ensure there were no academic loopholes, the researcher did an ultimate triple check on the data.
Even more math.
Just a little. They used what's called a triple difference model, or DDD, just in case there was some hidden variable unique to the Great Depression that the initial model missed. They compared Canada's trade to the UK against America's trade to the UK during the exact same months, controlling for exchange rates and GDP drops.
Oh, wow. Because the U.S. was explicitly excluded from all the special Ottawa discounts. America was locked on the outside of the wall.
Precisely. If the Ottawa Conference actually worked, Canada's trade with Britain should have massively, undeniably outperformed America's trade with Britain.
That makes total sense as a test.
But even in this hyper-strict no loopholes model, the data showed Canada did no better than the U.S. The special treaty provided virtually zero competitive advantage.
Incredible.
And the author didn't stop there. They extended the data to include 35 different British colonies and dependencies, running the numbers across the entire global footprint of the empire.
So measuring the entire imperial ecosystem, what did they find when they zoomed out that far?
A flat line. The marginal effect of the treaty on exports to those 35 colonies a year after enactment was a statistically insignificant negative 0.1%.
Still nothing.
The policy was a complete, demonstrable, undeniable failure across the board.
Which brings us to the ultimate question here. The elephant in the room. Why? Why couldn't the combined willpower of the largest, most powerful empire on Earth, armed with preferential tariffs and shared political goals, overcome the loss of the U.S. market?
It all comes down to an unforgiving iron law of economics that politicians constantly tragically underestimate: the law of geoeconomic gravity.
Let's pull up the map in our minds for a second. Canada shares a 2,000-mile continuous land border with the United States. They are geographically fused together. And at this time, in the late 1920s, trade between the U.S. and Canada alone constituted an astonishing 5% of all global trade.
It was the largest bilateral trading relationship on Earth, period. And Canada, in a fit of political pique and absolute desperation, was trying to replace that massive next-door neighbor with an island thousands of miles away across a vast, brutal, unpredictable ocean.
But if I'm a politician in 1932, I know about the ocean. That's why I'm passing the tariffs. Didn't they think the massive tax breaks would offset the shipping costs?
They did, but they were entirely delusional about the fundamental math of logistics. And the author of the source paper drops the absolute hammer here with the gravity calculation.
Okay, lay the math on me.
To artificially pull trade away from the U.S. and force it to the U.K., just to get back to the trade levels they enjoyed in 1929, the cost of shipping and doing business across the Atlantic would have had to magically drop by nearly 39% overnight.
39%? Wait, let's unpack the actual logistics of that. I put my wheat on a train in Toronto. What is the actual difference in friction between sending it to Detroit versus sending it to London?
It's the difference between a stroll across the street and an Arctic expedition. To send it to Detroit, you load a train car in Ontario, and it rolls directly across the border. Zero transfers, zero intermediate handling.
You sure easy.
To send it to London, you load the train, you ride it to a deep water port like Halifax, you pay workers to unload it, it sits in a warehouse accumulating storage fees, you pay to load it onto a steamship, you pay exorbitant maritime insurance.
And hope it doesn't sink.
Exactly. You cross the Atlantic, risking weather delays and winter storms. You arrive in Liverpool, pay workers to unload it, store it again, load it onto another British train, and finally ship it to its destination. Every single touch point is friction. Every single transfer is a massive cost.
And the politicians thought a piece of paper could just erase all those touch points. Let's put that 39% required cost drop in historical perspective. Has shipping ever gotten 39% cheaper overnight?
Let's look at the historical context the author provides. If you look at the period from 1870 to 1913, humanity went through a massive, world-altering technological revolution.
Like the Industrial Revolution hitting high gear.
We invented mass telegraph networks that crossed oceans, allowing instant communication. We switched the global fleet from slow wooden sailing ships to massive steel-hulled steamships. We literally carved open the earth to build global choke points like the Suez and Panama Canals.
Literally the greatest leaps in logistical technology in human history up to that point.
Exactly. And during those 40 years of unprecedented, earth-shattering technological miracles, transatlantic trade costs only fell by 13%.
Oh my God.
Yes.
13% over 40 years of miracles.
The politicians in 1932 genuinely believed that signing a piece of paper in Ottawa could instantly do 3 times the work of 40 years of the greatest technological advancements in human history.
That is insane.
It wasn't just optimistic, it was mathematical lunacy.
Because geography creates friction. Distance creates cost. You cannot write a law in Parliament that magically erases the Atlantic Ocean. You can't legislate away thousands of miles of deep water, maritime insurance, and winter storms.
Gravity always wins. Always. The massive economic weight of the United States, combined with its immediate geographic proximity to Canada, exerted a gravitational pull that no political treaty could ever hope to break. And the fascinating thing is, the politicians actually realized this much faster than they admitted in the history books. How fast? By January 1933, just 2 months after the Ottawa Treaty officially went into effect, Prime Minister Bennett The guy who won a landslide election, promising to blast away into new markets, completely capitulated.
He gave up 2 months in, after all that warlike rhetoric.
He had to. The economic pain was absolutely unbearable, and the merchants were investing. He stood before the Toronto Board of Trade and publicly admitted, and I quote, "Geographically, we are part of the North American continent, and it gives me no joy to remind you also that financially, it is in the same position."
Wow, that is the sound of a man hitting the pavement after trying to jump off a cliff.
It is the sound of gravity asserting itself. By 1935, the grand defiance of gravity was officially over. Canada was back at the negotiating table, signing reciprocal trade agreements with the United States. The grand experiment in radical geopolitical decoupling had completely spectacularly collapsed.
Okay, let's bring this historical deep dive crashing right into the present day. Because this is why this paper isn't just dusty academic history. It's a massive, blaring warning siren for today's economy.
It really is.
Look around right now. Turn on the news. We are hearing the exact same language from modern politicians that we heard in 1930 and 1932. Decoupling, friendshoring, slapping massive tariffs on our largest geopolitical rivals. We are watching leaders try to force incredibly complex, deeply integrated global supply chains to artificially reroute to distant allies based purely on political alignment, completely ignoring geographic and economic reality.
The parallels are uncanny. And frankly, they should be extremely alarming to anyone paying attention. We saw exactly what happened in 1932 when arrogance and political willpower tried to defy the natural gravity of markets.
It didn't work.
It didn't lead to a secure walled garden utopia where allies traded happily amongst themselves. It ended in a catastrophic loss of national wealth. It created paralyzing policy uncertainty that froze business investment, and it culminated in a humiliating rapid retreat to the very geographic realities they tried so desperately to ignore.
If you are an investor today or a business owner listening to politicians talk about building new semiconductor plants or supply chains in allied nations, this is exactly what you should be looking for in the contracts.
Yeah.
What is the cancellation clause? Where is the friction?
Where is the fine print?
Exactly.
Good.
Because as today's politicians gleefully draw up their plans to permanently sever natural supply chains across the globe in the name of political security, ask yourself a final question. Has humanity actually invented a way to turn off economic gravity? Or are we just driving the global economy off the exact same cliff, fully expecting to fly?